A pain reflex is the most fundamental biological imperative in existence. Touch a searing hot surface, and the sensory neurons instantly transmit a signal to the spinal cord, bypassing the brain entirely to force an immediate withdrawal. The organism must preserve itself. The organism must escape agony. This mechanism has driven evolution for hundreds of millions of years. Yet, this unbreakable law of nature contains a fatal flaw. The survival instinct can be overridden. It can be systematically and permanently deleted. There is a precise, measurable equation by which a living, breathing creature can be taught to embrace its own destruction. Decades ago, inside the sterilized laboratories of the University of Pennsylvania, researchers mapped out the exact blueprint for destroying the mammalian will to live. They discovered that if you subject an organism to a specific sequence of inescapable trauma, even when you finally open the doors and offer freedom, it will refuse to leave. We are going to explore the meticulous unraveling of hope, the surgical extraction of agency, and the terrifying discovery that helplessness is not a natural state of being, but a learned behavior. We are going to journey from the surface of academic curiosity, down into the absolute darkest depths of human psychology, examining the mechanical process of how a mind is broken. This is the story of Martin Seligman, the shuttle box, and the chilling realization that the deepest prisons are forged entirely inside the mind. To comprehend the sheer horror of what transpired in that laboratory, it is necessary to examine the scientific dogma of the middle 20th century. This era was entirely dominated by a rigid, unyielding psychological framework known as behaviorism. The architects of this field had reduced the complex, chaotic inner workings of the conscious mind to a series of cold, mechanical equations. They dictated that psychology must be an objective science. Because a thought cannot be observed, a feeling cannot be weighed, and a belief cannot be quantified, all internal states were deemed entirely irrelevant to the study of behavior. The mind was declared a black box. The organism was viewed merely as an input-output machine. You could only study what went into the box, the stimulus, and what came out of the box, the response. Behaviorism viewed all living creatures, humans and animals alike, as biological machines waiting to be programmed by their environment. The fundamental tenet was that all behavior is acquired through conditioning. If an organism performs an action and is rewarded, it will perform that action more frequently. If it is punished, it will perform that action less frequently. This was known as operant conditioning, a mathematically sound, meticulously tested paradigm that governed the entire field. It was clean, it was predictable, and it left absolutely no room for subjective experience. Animals were not feeling beings making choices, they were simply reflexive mechanisms responding to environmental pressures to maximize reward and minimize pain. Ivan Pavlov had earlier laid the groundwork for this mechanistic view with his famous experiments on classical conditioning. He demonstrated that a neutral stimulus, like the ringing of a bell, could become associated with a biologically potent stimulus, like food, to the point where the bell alone would induce salivation. The dog was not choosing to drool, it was a biological reflex, hijacked by an environmental pairing. The prevailing wisdom was that you could condition almost any response if you controlled the variables tightly enough. You could teach an animal to push a lever, to run through a maze, or to jump over a barrier, provided the consequences of those actions were clearly defined. This was the intellectual environment in which a young, ambitious graduate student named Martin Seligman found himself in 1965. He was working in the animal learning laboratory of Richard Solomon, a prominent researcher at the University of Pennsylvania. Seligman's lab was deeply invested in understanding fear conditioning. Specifically, they were trying to see if they could merge the principles of classical conditioning with operant conditioning. The objective was straightforward, almost mundane by the standards of the time. They wanted to take dogs, classically condition them to fear a specific high-pitched tone by pairing that tone with an electric shock, and then use that conditioned fear to motivate them to learn a new behavior. The planned experiment was designed in two distinct phases. In the first phase, the dogs would be restrained in a hammock. A tone would play, and shortly thereafter, a mild but painful electric shock would be delivered through the floor of the apparatus. According to the strict laws of behaviorism, the dog would quickly learn that the tone predicted the pain. The tone would become a conditioned stimulus, eliciting a profound physiological fear response. This was standard procedure. The second phase was meant to be the true test of learning. The dogs would be moved into a different apparatus known as a shuttle box. A shuttle box is a large, rectangular enclosure divided into two equal compartments by a low barrier or hurdle in the center. The floor of the box consists of an electrified grid. The premise was incredibly simple. The dog would be placed in one compartment. The high-pitched tone would play. Because of the previous conditioning, the dog would feel immediate, intense fear. To escape this fear, and to avoid the impending shock, the dog would naturally scramble over the low barrier to the other side of the box, which was not electrified. It was a perfectly logical hypothesis, built entirely upon the bedrock of decades of established behavioral science. An organism in pain, or anticipating pain, will always seek an avenue of escape. That was not a theory, it was considered an absolute law of biology. But when Seligman and his colleagues actually ran the experiment, the bedrock of behavioral science cracked wide open. The dogs did not behave like machines. They did not follow the equation. When placed into the shuttle box and subjected to the tone, and then the subsequent shock, the dogs who had previously been strapped into the hammock and given inescapable shocks did something that completely defied logic. They did not run. They did not frantically search for an exit. They did not leap over the barrier. Instead, these dogs simply collapsed onto the electrified grid. They lay down, curled into a defensive posture, and began to whimper softly, completely accepting the painful current coursing through their bodies. They made absolutely no effort to escape, even though the barrier was only shoulder high. It was easily visible. It was well within their physical capabilities to cross. Yet, they surrendered entirely. To a behaviorist, this was an impossibility. It was equivalent to dropping a stone and watching it fall upward. The most fundamental biological imperative, the drive to avoid pain and survive, had apparently vanished. Martin Seligman realized that something much darker and much more profound was occurring inside the black box of the mind. The dogs were not failing to learn a new behavior. They had already learned something far more powerful, something that overrode their basic instincts. During that first phase in the hammock, when they were strapped in tight and subjected to shocks they could not stop, they had learned a devastating lesson. They had learned that their actions had absolutely no effect on their environment. They had learned that nothing they did mattered. Seligman hypothesized that this belief, this deep-seated, unshakable conviction of their own powerlessness, had carried over into the new environment of the shuttle box. He termed this phenomenon learned helplessness. It was a revolutionary concept because it directly challenged the core premise of behaviorism. The dogs were not responding mechanically to the immediate stimulus of the shock in the shuttle box. They were responding to a cognitive expectation formed during their previous trauma. They had formed a belief. And that belief was literally paralyzing them. To prove this radical theory, Seligman knew he could not rely on accidental observations. He needed to design an experiment so rigorous, so airtight, that the behaviorist establishment could not dismiss it. He needed to meticulously dissect the anatomy of despair. He needed to prove that it was not the shock itself that broke the dogs, but the inescapable nature of the shock. And so, alongside his colleague Stephen Meyer, Seligman designed what is now infamous in the annals of psychology as the triadic yoked control design. This design is a masterpiece of experimental precision and, simultaneously, a nightmare of psychological manipulation. It remains one of the most chillingly effective methodologies ever created for stripping away the agency of a living creature. The goal was to isolate the variable of control. To do this, they required 3 distinct groups of dogs. Group 1 was designated as the escapable shock group. Group 2 was the yoked group, or the inescapable shock group. Group 3 was the control group, who would receive no shocks during the initial phase. The true brilliance, and the true cruelty, of the experiment lies entirely in the yoke design. The dogs in Group 1 and Group 2 were brought into the laboratory and placed into the suspension hammocks. These hammocks restrained their bodies completely, leaving only their heads free to move. Beside their heads, on either side, were small panels that could be pressed with the snout. The electrical shocks they were about to receive were wired together in a parallel circuit. This meant that when the experimenters threw the switch, the dog in Group 1 and the paired dog in Group 2 would receive the exact same electric shock, at the exact same intensity, for the exact same duration. Their physical experience of pain was utterly, perfectly identical. But their psychological reality was vastly different. For the dogs in Group 1, the escapable group, there was a way out. The panels next to their heads were fully functional. If the dog pressed its snout against the panel, the electrical circuit would instantly break, and the shock would stop. These dogs possessed control over their environment. For the dogs in Group 2, the inescapable yoked group, the panels were completely deactivated. They were dummy switches. No matter how many times the dog pressed the panel, no matter how hard it struggled, the shock would not stop. The electrical current would only cease when the yoked partner dog in Group 1 pressed its functional panel. Let us delve deeply into the precise subjective experience of these animals during this initial phase, because this is where the mechanism of learned helplessness is truly forged. Imagine being the dog in Group 1. You are strapped in, confused and restrained. Suddenly, an agonizing jolt of electricity courses through your body. You panic. You thrash wildly. In your frantic, uncoordinated movements, your snout accidentally bumps against the panel. Instantly, the pain stops. You pant, recovering, and a few moments later, another shock hits. Again, you thrash, you struggle, and you hit the panel. The pain stops. Very quickly, your mammalian brain, designed for pattern recognition, forms a critical connection. Action equals relief. I have power over my environment. My suffering is conditional, and I hold the key to my own salvation. You have learned agency. Now, imagine the sheer terror of being the dog in Group 2. The identical jolt of electricity hits you. You panic just like the other dog. You thrash. You bump your snout against the panel. Nothing happens. The pain continues to burn through your paws. You whine, you struggle, you push against the restraints with all your might. The pain continues. Suddenly, for reasons entirely disconnected from your own actions, the pain stops. This, of course, was because the Group 1 dog stopped it, but you have no way of knowing that. You are just relieved it is over. A few moments later, the shock returns. You try pressing the panel again. Nothing. You try barking. Nothing. You try staying completely still. The pain continues. Finally, randomly, it stops again. Over the course of 64 individual, intense electrical shocks, the dogs in Group 2 slowly realize a terrifying truth. They learn that no matter what they do, no matter what strategy they employ, the outcome is exactly the same. Their actions are completely divorced from the consequences. They are passengers in their own agony. During this conditioning phase, the behavior of the Group 2 dogs visibly transformed. The initial frantic struggling, the desperate attempts to find a solution, gradually gave way to a slow, methodical extinguishing of effort. They stopped pressing the dummy panels. They stopped barking. The vital energy drained from their bodies, replaced by a profound, lethargic stillness. They learned that resistance was futile. They were being taught, systematically and undeniably, that they were entirely helpless. The experimenters were effectively reaching into their minds and surgically severing the connection between will and action. 24 hours later, Seligman moved to phase 2 of the experiment. This was the true test, the moment of revelation. The dogs were taken out of the restraining hammocks and placed into the shuttle box, the large rectangular enclosure with the low barrier in the middle. The setup was brutally simple. The lights in the room would dim, serving as a warning signal that a shock was coming. 10 seconds later, the floor of the compartment the dog was standing in would electrify. All the dog had to do to avoid the pain was jump over the low barrier to the non-electrified side of the box. First, the control dogs from Group 3, who had experienced no previous shocks in the hammocks, were placed in the shuttle box. The lights dimmed. 10 seconds later, the floor electrified. The dogs barked, ran around frantically, quickly spotted the low barrier, and leapt over it. Within seconds, they were safe. After just a few trials, they learned the pattern perfectly. They would wait for the lights to dim, and then casually hop over the barrier before the shock even began. They demonstrated perfectly normal, healthy, adaptive behavior. Then came the dogs from Group 1, the escapable shock group. These were the dogs who had learned to control the shock in the hammocks by pressing the panels. When they were placed in the shuttle box, they reacted exactly like the control dogs. The shock hit, they scrambled, they assessed their environment, and they jumped the barrier. They adapted quickly and effectively. They had learned previously that their actions mattered, that they possessed agency, and they brought that critical lesson into the new environment. They believed they could find a solution to their suffering, and because they believed it, they did. And finally, the dogs from Group 2 were brought in. The inescapable yoked group. The dogs who had been taught, through 64 agonizing trials, that they had absolutely no control over their pain. They were placed into the shuttle box. The lights dimmed. The warning signal passed. The shock began. What happened next remains one of the most chilling testaments to the fragility of the spirit ever recorded in scientific literature. These dogs did not run. They did not frantically search for an escape. They did not even look at the barrier. When the electricity hit their paws, they simply lay down on the electrified grid. They curled themselves into a tight ball, began whimpering softly, and absorbed the punishment. The barrier was right there. It was mere inches high. They could clearly see the safe side. They had the physical strength to cross it. But the psychological paralysis was absolute. They had deeply internalized the belief that nothing they did would matter, and that learned belief completely overrode their most basic biological instinct for self-preservation. Even when the experimenters allowed the shock to continue for an excruciating 50 seconds, the dogs remained motionless. They had accepted their fate. They had been taught to be helpless, and they performed their helplessness perfectly. Seligman observed that the psychological damage inflicted upon these animals was deeply multifaceted. It was not merely a physical failure to move, it was a profound breakdown occurring on three distinct cognitive levels. First, there was a severe motivational deficit. The animals had lost the internal drive to initiate any voluntary action. The fundamental spark of agency had been extinguished. Why try anything if nothing works? Second, there was a profound cognitive deficit. Even if, by some random chance or involuntary muscle spasm, an inescapable dog accidentally scrambled over the barrier and actually escaped the shock, they completely failed to learn from the experience. In subsequent trials, instead of repeating the successful action, they would revert right back to lying down and taking the shock. The traumatic conditioning of the hammock had shattered their ability to connect their own actions to a positive outcome. The cognitive bridge between effort and reward had been destroyed. And third, there was an emotional deficit. The dogs in Group 2 displayed all the classic, physiological signs of severe clinical depression. They exhibited profound lethargy, a complete loss of appetite, persistent whimpering, and a dull, hollow emptiness in their overall demeanor. They were not just behaving differently, they were emotionally broken creatures. The implications of this discovery were immediate, sweeping, and utterly terrifying. If helplessness could be manufactured so easily, so cleanly, in a laboratory setting using a simple electrical circuit, what did this mean for the human condition? We have to understand that Seligman's experiment was never really just about dogs. It was a dark, unyielding mirror reflecting the deepest, most shadowed corners of human despair. Psychologists around the world recognized the profound implications and quickly began to replicate the concepts of learned helplessness in human subjects. Obviously, ethical constraints prevented them from using severe electric shocks on people, but the methodology was eerily, disturbingly similar. In 1974, a researcher named Donald Hiroto conducted a landmark experiment using human participants and blasts of highly irritating, abrasive noise. The setup was a direct, almost identical echo of Seligman's triadic design. Hiroto divided his human subjects into three distinct groups. Group 1 was placed in a room and subjected to a painfully loud noise, but they were given a control panel with a button. If they pressed the button, the noise would stop. Group 2 was subjected to the exact same noise, for the exact same duration, but their buttons were dead. No matter what they pushed, no matter how frustrated they became, the noise continued until the yoked partner in Group 1 turned it off. Group 3 was the control, sitting in silence. In the second phase of the experiment, all the subjects were placed into a completely new situation. They were given a device called a finger shuttle box. They put their finger on a track, and when the loud noise began again, All they had to do was slide their finger a few inches to the other side of the track to instantly terminate the sound. It was the exact human equivalent of a dog jumping the low barrier. The results of Hiroto's experiment were a chilling, exact confirmation of Seligman's findings with the dogs. The people in the control group and the escapable noise group quickly figured out how to slide their fingers. As soon as the noise started, they moved their hand, and the room went quiet. They demonstrated agency. But the people in Group 2, the inescapable noise group, exhibited the exact same psychological paralysis as the dogs in the shuttle box. They sat there, passively enduring the blaring, abrasive noise, making absolutely no effort to find a solution. In a matter of minutes, a simple, rigged button had completely destroyed their initiative. They had learned that they were powerless, and they carried that powerlessness into a completely solvable situation. But the terrifying scope of learned helplessness did not stop with loud noises or physical discomfort. Researchers began to test the phenomenon using purely cognitive, intellectual tasks. Human subjects were given a series of anagrams to solve. For one group, the anagrams were normal, easily solvable word puzzles. For the other group, the anagrams were complete gibberish, mathematically impossible to solve. The second group tried to solve the first puzzle, and failed. They tried the second puzzle, and failed again. They grew frustrated, their confidence chipped away with every impossible task. After several of these impossible anagrams, both groups were given a final, extremely simple anagram, one that a child could easily solve in seconds. The group that had experienced success with the earlier puzzles solved the final one instantly. But the group that had been subjected to the impossible task simply stared at the letters. Many of them didn't even pick up their pens. They had been taught, through repeated, unavoidable failure, that their cognitive efforts were useless, and so they literally stopped thinking. Their minds simply shut down in the face of a challenge. This brings us to the most unsettling part of our investigation, the realization that learned helplessness is not confined to the sterile walls of a laboratory. It is the invisible, structural architecture of countless human tragedies. It is the silent killer hiding in the shadows of our society, the mechanism that keeps the marginalized trapped, the abused silent, and the depressed paralyzed. Consider the terrifying reality of domestic abuse. Why does a victim stay with a violently abusive partner? To those on the outside, looking in with an objective eye, the solution seems incredibly obvious. Leave. Run away. Pack a bag and walk out the door. Jump the barrier. But outsiders do not see the invisible harness. A victim of chronic abuse is subjected to a continuous, unpredictable series of psychological and physical shocks. No matter what they do, no matter how much they try to placate the abuser, no matter how perfectly they follow the rules, the punishment comes anyway. They learn, through agonizing, daily repetition, that their actions have absolutely no effect on the violence. They are taught, systematically and brutally, that they are helpless. And when the door is finally left open, when a genuine opportunity to escape presents itself, the victim, paralyzed by the deep conditioning of learned helplessness, simply stays on the electrified grid. They have internalized the belief that escape is impossible, that any attempt will only lead to worse punishment, and that belief becomes a prison far stronger than any physical lock. Look at the devastating, multi-generational effects of chronic poverty. Millions of individuals are trapped in socio-economic systems where hard work does not lead to advancement, where effort is constantly thwarted by systemic barriers, discrimination, and a lack of resources. Over time, the repeated failure to control their financial destiny, despite their best efforts, breeds a profound, societal motivational deficit. It is deeply insulting to label this as laziness. It is the psychological scarring of inescapable economic shock. Why try to jump the barrier when every experience you have ever had has taught you that the barrier stretches infinitely upward, and that the shock will come regardless of your effort? We see this phenomenon clearly in institutionalization. Think of prisoners serving long sentences, long-term patients in psychiatric hospitals, or even children in incredibly rigid, authoritarian school systems. These are environments that intentionally strip away personal autonomy, that dictate every waking moment, that severely punish deviation, and demand absolute compliance. These environments are the human equivalent of Seligman's yoked harness. They methodically extract the locus of control from the individual, rendering them passive, compliant, and ultimately, deeply helpless. When these individuals are finally released back into the free world, they often flounder. They are unable to make basic decisions, unable to initiate action, unable to navigate a world that requires agency. The shuttle box of freedom is terrifying because they have simply forgotten how to move on their own. And then, there is the most pervasive, invisible manifestation of all, clinical depression. Martin Seligman himself shifted his entire career focus to this area, heavily pushing the theory that learned helplessness is a foundational component, if not the primary underlying cause, of certain types of severe depression. When a person experiences repeated failures, traumatic losses, or chronic stressors that they absolutely cannot control, they begin to construct a generalized, toxic belief in their own fundamental powerlessness. They develop what Seligman called an explanatory style that is pervasive, permanent, and personal. They begin to believe that bad things will always happen, that they will happen in every single area of their life, and that it is fundamentally their fault because they are inherently, irreparably flawed. This cognitive triad is the ultimate human expression of the emotional deficit seen in the dogs on the grid. It is the soul curling into a ball, whimpering in the dark, and accepting the pain as a permanent condition of existence. But our story does not end entirely in the darkness. There is a resolution to this investigation, though it is hard-won, fragile, and deeply unsettling in its implications. Seligman, profoundly disturbed by the lasting damage he had caused his subjects, wanted to know if learned helplessness could be reversed. If helplessness is learned, can it be unlearned? Could the dogs be taught to hope again? He returned to the shuttle box. The inescapable dogs were lying on the electrified grid, passively absorbing the shock. Seligman and his team tried calling to them from the safe side. They tried coaxing them. They tried offering them their favorite food. Nothing worked. The motivational deficit was simply too strong. The belief in their own helplessness was a brick wall that could not be breached by incentives. Finally, the researchers realized that if the dog would not initiate the action had to be initiated for them. They had to physically step into the box. They picked up the trembling dogs. They physically carried them over the barrier, placing them gently onto the safe, non-electrified side. They forced them to experience success. But one time was not enough. The cognitive deficit was deeply entrenched. They had to do this repeatedly. They dragged the dogs across the barrier, over and over again, physically forcing the realization that the safe side existed, and that the shock could, in fact, be escaped. Slowly, painfully, the dogs began to understand. They required dozens of physical interventions, dozens of forced successes, before the tiny spark of agency returned. But eventually, after massive external effort, they began to jump on their own. They learned that they could act. They learned that they could escape. The traumatic conditioning was finally broken, but it required an overwhelming external force to shatter the psychological prison they had built for themselves. This brings us to the chilling, inescapable conclusion of our journey into the dark psychology of helplessness. We are all deeply, fundamentally vulnerable to the machinery of this phenomenon. Our minds, like the minds of Seligman's dogs, are perfectly calibrated to recognize patterns of failure and to adjust our behavior accordingly. It is, at its core, a survival mechanism. If you are trapped under a collapsed building, thrashing wildly will only exhaust your oxygen and lead to a faster death. In certain extreme situations, passivity is a biological advantage. But in the modern world, this survival mechanism can easily turn into a psychological death sentence. Every time you face an insurmountable obstacle, every time you pour your heart and soul into an endeavor only to watch it crumble into dust, every time you are subjected to the unpredictable, inescapable shocks of a chaotic world, the invisible harness tightens around you. The dark, uncomfortable truth is that passivity is easy. Giving up requires absolutely no caloric energy. It is the default, resting state of a broken system. Agency, the will to fight, the stubborn, irrational belief that your actions actually matter, this is what requires profound, continuous, exhausting effort. It is a delicate, flickering flame that must be constantly guarded against the cold, indifferent winds of reality. Think about your own life. Examine the corners of your existence with brutal honesty. Think about the specific areas where you have simply stopped trying. The toxic, soul-crushing job that you complain about every single day, but never actively attempt to leave. The broken, manipulative relationship that you quietly endure, convincing yourself that it is normal, but never attempt to fix or escape. The grand, ambitious dreams that you quietly abandoned years ago because the initial failures hurt too much to bear. You must ask yourself a terrifying question. Are you staying in these situations because the barrier is genuinely, objectively too high? Or are you staying because somewhere along the line, in the hammock of your past traumas and failures, you were taught that you could not jump? Martin Seligman's dogs were victims of a cruel, meticulously calculated laboratory experiment. But their suffering revealed the terrifying fragility of the mammalian spirit, a fragility that exists within every single one of us. We walk through a world filled with invisible electric grids, hidden harnesses, and inescapable shocks. The pain will come. The failures will happen. The shocks are an inevitable component of the human experience. But the paralysis is a choice. It is a choice we are often completely unaware we are making, dictated by a conditioned belief that we are passengers in our own lives. You must examine the cages you have built for yourself. You must relentlessly question the assumptions that govern your inaction. Because the most insidious, the most unbreakable form of control is the one that you enforce upon yourself. The door might be wide open right now. The barrier keeping you from a better life might be mere inches high. Freedom, agency, and relief might be waiting just on the other side of the room. But none of that matters. The open door is completely irrelevant, if your mind has already accepted the pain as a permanent condition. The experiment is ongoing. The lights in your life are dimming. The warning signal is sounding. The question is, what will you do when the floor electrifies?